breaking news that could have a devastating impact on the future of fighter pay. Now, before we get started, I want to shout out at Brian C on the channel. We've been going back and forth in the comments the last few days on the topic of fighter pay, and he brought this to my attention and I wanted to make a video about it. The UFC will once again try to settle a long-running class action lawsuit initially filed by Kung Lee and others more than a decade ago. The new settlement number is now $375 million, which is an increase of 11% from the original number the UFC proposed back in March, and it was denied by Judge Richard Boulware in July. Now, in this video, we're going to break away from our normal style and format where I bring you the daily news about current fights and fighters, and we're going to discuss the details of this lawsuit and what it means. Now, full disclaimer, I am not an attorney. I just feel like I probably need to say that. I don't know why. I'm just a regular dumb dude who easily gets confused by anything more complicated than changing a spare tire. So in this video, we're going to do our best to dumb everything down to a 5th grade reading level and explain what's happening. But to begin, I feel it's appropriate that we get in the Wayback Machine back to the year 2011 when the UFC signed Sanshou Karate champion and former Strikeforce middleweight champion Kung Lee to its roster. Just like the forgettable UFC headliner Tahuna vs. Marquardt, you might have purged these memories from your brain forever, so let me give you a quick refresher. Kung Lee was one of those fringe MMA stars, I guess you would say. He was outside the UFC that fans absolutely loved. It was very similar to guys in those days like Shinya Aoki or Fedor Emelianenko. These were fighters that everyone wanted to see in the octagon. He had an exciting and he had a different style that produced entertaining fights, like his matches with Tony Strickland or even Frank Shamrock. He won the Strikeforce middleweight championship after breaking Shamrock's arm with kicks, but on September 17, 2009, Strikeforce CEO Scott Coker announced that Lee had relinquished his belt after securing a major motion picture deal in, checks notes here, where was it? Oh, okay, it was the movie Fighting, starring Channing Tatum?
Bruh.
What the, bro? You weren't even in a major role. Quick side note, I like how this person named Nina Poon plays the role of questionable Asian.
Bruh.
What is that? Anyways, after that disaster, Lee came back to MMA. Lee said that it was basically the UFC or bust for him at this point in his fighting career, saying, quote, "I know for a fact that if I do fight again, it's going to be in the UFC. I've never fought in the UFC, but I would love to fight in the UFC. But right now, because of my contract with Showtime and Strikeforce, hopefully things can work out because there is a show in San Jose that Cain Velasquez is the main event on. I would love to fight in San Jose for the UFC." Now, I want you to remember this quote because we're going to come back and revisit this potentially damning statement later on. The UFC signed Lee to a 6-fight deal in 2011. His first fight was supposed to be against Vitor Belfort, but after Vitor was pulled from the card, he squared up against the axe murderer himself, Vanderlei Silva. Now, Lee lost that fight by TKO and left with a broken nose. What's interesting is, if you trust the public payout reporting, Kung Lee made a total of $350,000, which doesn't take into account any potential bonus, or at that time, fighters were allowed to get sponsors. It doesn't take into account any of the sponsorship money. Now, no doubt, $350,000 is not a lot of money for a prize fighter. It should naturally be more. However, in 2011, $350,000 would have put Lee in the category of, quote, highly paid UFC fighters. It was a lot of money back then. Lee was likely one of the highest paid fighters on the roster. Kung Lee never completed his 6-fight deal with the UFC. He left the organization with a .500 record at 2 wins and 2 losses. In 2011, Kung Lee, along with Nate Quarry, John Fitch, Brandon Vera, and Kyle Kingsbury. Why does that name sound so familiar? Oh yeah, that's right. He was the guy that shot his load on another man's sushi and made him eat it.
Let's sing I Ate Somebody Else's Semen.
Anyways, the fighters filed a lawsuit claiming a bunch of things. Now remember your boy Tabs here, he isn't the sharpest knife in the drawer, and when I read these court filings, it gets super confusing really quick. But it's the year 2024, and we have cool tools like ChatGPT. So I uploaded the document, and I told ChatGPT to summarize it for me like I was in 5th grade, and here's what it spit out. Alright, ChatGPT, I want you to do your magic. Take this document and summarize it like I was in the 5th grade. And here we go. Alright. Oh, geez, it's already getting kind of long. Alright, here's what I want you to do, ChatGPT. Take all this stuff and make it even more simple. Alright. Who is suing? Some fighters who used to fight in the UFC, like Kung Lee and others. The UFC is too powerful. It makes it hard for other companies to organize fights. Fighters are paid less. This makes a lot more sense. Thanks, bro. So basically, as I understand it, the fighters were mad that they got paid less and that the UFC shut out smaller organizations from even being able to compete with them. The UFC made money from merch and the fighters basically got nothing or very little in comparison. This sort of stuff is always confusing to me because, and this is where it sort of pains me to side with Dana, but I always ask, didn't you guys ever read your contracts before you signed them? Now, go back to that quote from Kung Lee where he said, quote, "I know for a fact that if I do fight again, it's going to be in the UFC. I've never fought in the UFC, but I would love, there's a key word, love to fight in the UFC. But right now, because of my contract with Showtime and Strikeforce, hopefully things can work out." So, let me get this straight. He doesn't like the contract he signed with Strikeforce because it limits him. Okay, that's understandable. But then he goes and signs a worse deal with the UFC? Help me understand this, guys. Are these guys so enamored with fighting in the UFC and under the UFC brand that they don't ask these sort of questions? Questions like, "Hey Dana, can I get some extra money from my action figure doll sales?" Do these guys have managers, agents, anyone who can explain their contracts to them? The UFC has defended itself by saying it has invested in the sport while pointing out that rival promotions that have emerged over the past 3 decades as evidence of an equal playing field. It is certainly true that Dana and the UFC have made MMA, the sport of MMA, what it is today. There's no question about that. They've expanded the sport all over the globe. They were really the only game in town in 2020 when they had Fight Island. They cut a TV deal with ESPN. Pay-per-views happen almost every week, and that could be a good or bad thing. And fighters do make more money today than they did back in Kung Lee's day. There's little doubt that the sport is in a much better place in 2024 than it was in 2011. But fast forward to today. TKO Group, the UFC's parent company, has tried to reach a settlement, the originally proposed $335 million, and it was rejected by a judge in July. The Fighters Group did accept the new offer of $375 million, and all that's left is for the judge to give it the green light. Again, it's all a little confusing, but I did find this video on Twitter from @Eric, I don't know his name, a Canadian combat sports lawyer who sums it up pretty nicely.
A brand new settlement was just announced in the UFC antitrust class action lawsuit. I just want to quickly break down what this means. So it was announced that the UFC is going to pay $375 million to settle the Lee class action lawsuit against them. Now, you might remember not many months ago, a $335 million settlement was reached and it was rejected by the court. Now, the court still hasn't given his full published reasons of why it was rejected, but one of the issues was that $335 million was settling 2 separate class actions. The Lee case, which covers fighters from 2010 to 2017, and the Johnson case, which covers fighters from 2017 onward. That money was going to be split by everybody, with most of it going to the Lee fighters. This new deal is only for the Lee class, and it's paying $375 million to that class, and presumably it's not dealing with any kind of contractual changes or injunctive relief. That's still left open for the Johnson class to pursue, as well as seeking damages for them. Now, whether the court is going to approve this, only time will tell. If we had the judge's reasons for why he rejected the last deal, it'd be a little bit easier to guess whether this is going to meet approval. But basically, the Lee class is getting about $70 million more dollars than the last deal. And the concern about the UFC's business model, their monopoly, and their contractual structure is still left for the Johnson fighters to pursue. So this deal has a better chance of being approved, but time will tell.
Fighter pay has always been an issue, and I suspect that no matter how much the fighters make, it will always be an issue. Look no further than MMA's close cousin, boxing, as an example. Most fighters will certainly believe that they should be paid more, and I generally agree with them. They should be paid more. But I also remember back at UFC 196 how much of a big deal it was when Conor McGregor became the first fighter known to make 7 figures off of one fight. He got $1 million to fight that night. Now fast forward to today when the top fighters are making way more money. According to Front Office Sports, the total UFC compensation for Conor McGregor is $39.3 million, followed by Khabib at $23 million, Alistair Overeem at $15 million, and Anderson Silva at $13.5 million. Like boxing, the top fighters will always make 99% of all the money, while the B and C players get the scraps. Fairness is always subjective and up for debate. What I think is fair, what you think is fair, and what they think is fair is always going to be different. But I'm really curious as to what you guys think. What impact do you think this lawsuit will have on the way that UFC does business going forward? Let's discuss that in the comments below. And that does it all for today's video, but make sure you like this video, subscribe to the channel, and click the bell notification so you can get notified every time we release a new video. And in case you missed it, check out yesterday's news.